Hi there, it's March the 23rd and we're continuing our progress through the good news of Luke. We're in chapter 5, starting at verse 29, going through to chapter 6, verse 11. The stories in this reading we have are very much focused around Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees and scribes. Now the Pharisees were a sect of Judaism that saw their establishment date back to the time of the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes 200 years before. And this had been a time when Antiochus Epiphanes had sought to impose Greek culture and Greek ways on the Jewish people and persecuted them. And out of the revolt, out of the Maccabean revolt and Judas Maccabeus, arose this sect, this group of people who saw themselves as protectors of the law. Except it wasn't really Torah they were protecting, it was the fences around Torah. It was the things they'd added, the traditions that they saw had to be kept, particularly to do with Sabbath observance, with dietary observances, and so on. And in these events we're reading about here, they are facing Jesus off with their traditions versus Jesus' compassionate ways. Now Levi, the tax collector, we've seen has just come to follow Jesus, and he wants to throw a big party, so he invites his friends, and of course the people he's inviting as his friends are the people who are like him, and they are fellow tax collectors and other people who the Pharisees would consider to be sinners and beyond the pale of the law, beyond the pale of godliness. But Jesus says to them when they upbraid him about this, why is he eating with sinners? He says it's the sick people who need a doctor, not those who are well. Jesus makes it clear that he has come in compassion to reach out to those who are beyond the pale, to those who need to know the joy of homecoming. Jesus says the old ways are not going to wash anymore. And actually, if you try and put new wine into old wineskins, it's going to break. Jesus is saying there's a radical change coming. So often when God does something new, it's easy to resist it, and it's easy to dismiss the new thing that God is doing based on the old thing God did. But we can see that God is a God of not just new wine, but new wineskins, and he's constantly bringing new things into place so that what he's doing today fits the context of today. That's what Jesus is saying. Then another standoff comes when his disciples are walking on the Sabbath after Passover through the fields, and the grain is just coming to fruition, and they just take a little bit and they rub it in their hands and they eat the lovely glutinous powder that's inside it. And the Pharisees see this, or they hear about it, and they criticize Jesus and say, why are your disciples doing this on the Sabbath when they shouldn't be? This is work. This is classed as work. Jesus simply says to them, look, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am the one who that the Sabbath is not man made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is made for man. It's God's rest. It's not about keeping minute little traditions to try and keep God happy. And Jesus shows that their complaint is actually based on their view of the traditions, not based on God's heart. They also asked Jesus about why his disciples don't fast. And again, fasting, there are very few fasts actually laid down in Torah, very few fasts that Jews keep. But the Pharisees were those who fasted a lot because they thought it earned them brownie points. They thought that God would listen to them. But Jesus says, look, there is fasting, but it's not according to rote. It's not according to laid down traditions. My disciples will fast when, in a sense, the Spirit leads them to, when the bridegroom is not with them, when they want to reach out to God. It's not a basis of keeping traditions, it's a basis of following the heart. And so Jesus is saying there will be fasting, but it will be according to the power of the Spirit. And then lastly, Jesus is in the synagogue, and there's a man there who has a withered hand. And this is Sabbath, of course, when they're together, Jesus seems to be about to heal him, and there's a real contention here. There's a real tension in the synagogue because they're watching to see whether Jesus heals on the Sabbath. Because even healing on the Sabbath, the Pharisees thought was something shouldn't be done. It's classed as work. But Jesus says, are we going to do good on the Sabbath, or are we going to do evil? And he calls the man to come and stand in the middle of the synagogue, and he basically speaks to him to stretch out his arm, and as he stretches out his arm, his hand is healed. And all the people are amazed at what Jesus has done. We constantly need to keep a watch on our hearts, on adding things to what God is saying, on adding our own traditions, our own laws. There are so many things like Sunday observance, things like the kind of Bible we read, whether it's a particular translation or another, things that we do which actually add to God's ways, the wearing of hats and so on, which is very much cultural and not to do with our closeness and our relationship with God. So let's watch that our traditions don't become the old wineskins into which God can't pour the new wine. Let's constantly be saying to God, what are the new wineskins for today that you want to pour the new wine into? Have a very good March the 23rd.